Hello and welcome back to Sociology 101. As I'm starting here, I'm recognizing some of the side chats. Someone is mentioning that I didn't show up last time. That's because I misscheduled one of my broadcasts that I've got coming up, and I had to reschedule it, and apologize for that. And right now, I'm getting an indication that my internet is unstable, which is disheartening. Anytime you jump online on a live broadcast and your internet is immediately unstable, that makes things a little questionable. So I'm going to ask those on the side chat, am I coming through okay? Is it glitchy? Because if it is, I may just stop and restart, because I would rather have a good video than a bad one when it comes to answering these things. The picture is grainy, Michael is saying. Yeah, for one, usually the sound is good here. He says, okay. Usually I've got full bars, nothing problem, because I'm plugged in to my router and I've got like the best internet possible. So usually not a problem, but it's not saying it anymore. So I'm going to continue on. Those who listen to us regularly know that one of our favorite interlocutors in this debate, in this discussion, has been Dr. James White. He recently did a broadcast confronting provisionism and me specifically, and a broadcast that I did with Frank Turek. Actually, the broadcast with Frank Turek was months ago. The reason it's just now coming up, I think, is because Frank on his broadcast is clipping out sections of our discussion and putting it on his page, and therefore it's getting more playtime, which I'm happy for, because obviously that tells more people about us and what we're doing. So I'm thankful for Dr. Turek broadcasting our discussion, but it's gotten a little heat from the Calvinistic side, which you would expect. That's just the way these things happen sometimes. And as I've told you many times, 99% of my videos about James White are responses to him. So some people try to paint it as me being obsessed with him, or I'm responding to a well-known Calvinist. I enjoy responding to people who are bringing critique, and so that's what I'm trying to do here. And I want to do so in love towards somebody who's not showing a lot of love towards me, because I want to hopefully model that example for all of us to follow, because we're all going to face this. We're all going to face people who just don't treat us very well. That's just going to happen in these kinds of discussions. And that's not just unique to Calvinism, by the way. I had 3 Calvinists since this video came out apologizing for the behavior of James White. 3 different guys. 2 of them are personal close friends of mine. One of them is an internet guy that just knows me from the internet. And so this is not about Calvinism. The way you treat other people is not about whether you're a Calvinist or not. I know very strong, staunch Calvinists who are actually very nice and cordial and loving, and don't like the demeanor and the way in which James White is handling our controversy. Okay, so I'm just trying to make that. It says it's unstable again. The internet. I'm not sure why it's doing that. That really frustrates me whenever I put it all together and everything's ready, and then the internet goes unstable. But apparently that's what I'm going to be dealing with today. So. That's one of the ways in which I want to deal with this is by showing the clip that James White did just recently confronting Frank and myself. And I'm going to hopefully show you some things that we should avoid trying to do. And all of us can fall into this, myself included. There have been times in which, I've stepped over the line on issues, and I've re-recorded videos, or I've taken them down, or I've apologized. Because we all in the flesh can fall into this. And I know that for whatever reason, Dr. White, being an apologist all his life, he doesn't do evangelism events like I do. Maybe that's where I could say he's in balance, because he's always talking about me being in balance, because Calvinism is all you talk about. At least that's what his accusation is, the one-string banjo thing. And the truth of the matter is, this is all I talk about on this broadcast, because I created it for this broadcast separately from what I do for a living, which is evangelism and apologetics training. And so my accusation to James White is, because you don't do a lot of evangelism events like I do, and a lot of love type relationship events, that maybe your apologetics ministry of always battling with other Christians and atheists has hardened you so much that now you don't know how to have a healthy interaction with a brother who disagrees with you. Well, I back up on that. I think he knows how to, because he demonstrates that with Michael Brown, for example. In other words, I know he knows how to have a proper disagreement with someone who disagrees with him, because he's demonstrated that with Michael Brown. And so I know he can do it. Why he chooses not to do it with me or with Frank or with some other, like David Allen, some other non-Calvinist out there in the world, I don't know. I don't know why he chooses to engage with some and not others. And yeah, there's Derek Breeler. Shout out to you. The shout out to the Provisionist Twitter followers. Thanks for following on Twitter. And by the way, Derek, and along with Nathan and several others on Twitter, are always really good at answering a lot of the tweeted questions towards us that I don't have time to engage with all of them. And Derek is one of them that's always usually good to jump in and give some good answers. And so I appreciate that. And so I want to play him in his own words. I want him to speak for himself. I don't know how to better represent Calvinism than to let Calvinists speak for themselves. By the way, James White has a standing invitation to come onto my program and to discuss these things with me. He's had that since our debate. In fact, I told him that personally. He made a joke about, hey, come ride your bike with me. And I said I would be so winded I wouldn't be able to keep up with you to have a discussion. He joked about coming to ride the bike, and I said, hey, let's just do a broadcast together. Let's just talk about this. You have a standing invitation anytime you want to come talk about these things. He's heard that personally. He knows that. Okay, I've said I'll come onto your show. Matter of fact, there was even one time, Rich Pierce can attest to this, I called in to one of the call-in shows, and he didn't, for whatever reason, I'm not saying it was nefarious, but he didn't want to take my call. They had another scheduled thing coming up, and Rich politely declined putting me on the air with White. I want to have this discussion, okay? I'm open to having these discussions. So when people try to paint it like I'm running from him or all these kinds of things, because that's sometimes the way White paints it, you've got to be willing to hear both sides of the discussion. And that's part of the lesson that I want this video to be, is I want us to say, okay, here's what we need to try to avoid, ourselves included. Because let's just be honest, let's look at ourselves in the mirror. We do some of the things you're going to see White doing too. And I say we, the collective group, those of us who are not Calvinists, some of us have engaged in the exact same fallacious and uncharitable ways that you're about to witness from Dr. White. And some of you know it's true, because I know it's true of me sometimes too. So this is not just, hey, let's all get on our bandwagon and get after James White. This is, let's learn from our own behaviors and the bad behaviors of those around us, and say, here's what you don't do when you're debating theology with a brother. Okay? When you're debating theology with a brother or sister in Christ, here's the things you should not do. And you're going to see all of them, I think, very well exemplified and shown to us. For example, here's some of the things you'll see from Dr. White here in this video. You'll see question-begging fallacy. The question-begging fallacy can be pointed out very simply. If you can just repeat the same thing back to them that they have said to you, that's a question-begging fallacy. Your doctrine is man-centered, okay? That's a question-begging fallacy. Why? Because I can say the exact same thing. Nuh-uh, yours is man-centered. It's a question-begging fallacy. You're stupid. This is playground level, okay? You're stupid. No, you're stupid, okay? You don't do proper exegesis. No, you don't do proper exegesis. That's a question-begging fallacy. Who's ever right is doing the proper exegesis. Whoever is right has the God-centered, correct theology. Whoever has a man-made theology is man-centered. Okay, so these are just substanceless accusations that don't take the discussion anywhere. All they do is add heat rather than light. They bring the discussion down into the muck and the mire, and they are absolutely absurd. Question-begging fallacies abound in what you're about to hear from James White, and I'll point them out as we go through them. Ad hominem fallacies. These are to the man. Instead of talking about the argument that the man is making, it's more like bad Leighton. Leighton is a one-string banjo. This is all Leighton ever talks about. He never really was a Calvinist. He never has known anything about Calvinism. He's long-winded and he rambles. He's a tall gremlin, I was called at one time by Dr. White. Pour water on him and get angry. All these kinds of things these are ad hominem fallacies. The ad hominem fallacy is, instead of answering the argument, I talk about how the person isn't really who he says he is. He's really heading towards the liberal or the open theist positions, and therefore those have already been dismissed as being heretical, and so he's going there anyway. So what is all of that? All of that is, instead of answering the actual argument that I made, I will paint the person who's bringing this argument. I'll paint him in the worst light possible. Okay. And he's face planning. He's just this blah 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 ramblings. Which some of the accusations are true. I am long-winded and I ramble sometimes. That's true. My wife can attest to that. Okay, so that there's one part of the accusation that's probably about right. But these kinds of things are to the man. It's about the person instead of about the argument, and we need to try to avoid that. Just being uncharitable. Lacking grace. Instead of still manning your opponent, you straw man your opponent, which we'll get into as well. You're just saying things that are obviously trying to be mean, things he would never say to his friend Michael Brown, even though Michael Brown comes to the same theological conclusions that I've come to for the most part. And so saying these kinds of things just are not charitable. They're not showing grace to a brother that you believe. And by the way, we have video of White saying he believes I'm a brother. He doesn't cast me out of the kingdom, and we can be thankful for that. And he actually rebukes people for doing that kind of thing. And so he's presumably talking to somebody he believes is a regenerate brother, a brother in Christ, and yet he's not treating me with the kind of grace that a brother should treat another brother. But we know he can, because he does it with Michael Brown, and he even does it with Muslims. I've seen him treat Muslims with a lot more respect than he treats me or David Allen or other traditionalists. And so why he kind of has us on his target in that way and treating us specifically in a more negative way than he does Michael Brown, you'd have to ask him as his motivations for doing that. But for whatever reason, that's the way he's taken us on. Okay, guilt by association. You'll see this as well. He'll associate me with this group or with that group. Therefore, I must be guilty, bad man kind of stuff. Again, guilt by association, just another form of ad hominem fallacy. That if he relates to this bad character in some way, then we don't have to really listen to him. You'll also hear him making unsubstantiated accusations about what people have said about me behind my back that supposedly knew me in the past, but yet never substantiating, never giving any kind of documentation for it, saying where he's got his information, making accusations like, well, you're doing this fallacy, but never show how I'm committing that fallacy. That's a difference between me and him. I'll actually let you hear his fallacy and tell you why it's a fallacy. He'll just make blanket accusations that I'm committing fallacies without demonstrating here's the fallacy and here's why it's a fallacy. And so, and the last one is just condescension. And you'll see especially this towards Frank Turek, where White really talks down to him, like, well, you're just not very educated. You're not very well read. And you'll see all of these things being practiced here in this discussion, which I think is unfortunate. And these are the things I think we need to try to avoid. So let's jump in. I clipped a little bit of stuff out because he does, just like I do, rambles a little bit and telling stories. So I had to clip some of it down, and even then, it's still a pretty long clip. So we'll try to get through as much as we can of it, and we'll go from there. So here we are.
We have spent. I wonder if anyone has gone back and added up the number of hours we've spent responding to, talking about, discussing the claims of Leighton Flowers and the provisionists. You'll notice we haven't done that a whole lot recently because, to be honest with you, there's only so much to be said. There's only so many ways to demonstrate that provisionism is a man-centered, incoherent, unbiblical mess of gobbledygook. Okay,
so man-centered, meaningless, rambling, gobbledygook, all these kinds of things. What is that? It's uncharitable, one. It's the question-begging fallacy. It's assuming that your views are perfectly God-centered and perfectly right, and therefore everybody else is wrong. He would never say those things about what Michael Brown believes, even though Michael Brown and I almost agree entirely with regard to our sociological positions. And yet notice how he treated provisionists just by that list of adjectives. That is not the way you debate a brother in Christ. It's a bad way of doing it. some of us, I'm going to put us in there because I can fall into that too, can treat and do treat at times Calvinist exactly that way by calling it gobbledygook and man-centered. I mean, think about what is more man-centered. I've heard people make this argument. Well, I mean, the doctrine that says you, before you were ever created, God had you on his mind and he picked you, that can be made into being man-centered. Now, of course, Calvinists don't think of it that way, but neither do we think of us being man-centered just simply because we think God gives us the responsibility to say yes or no to his appeals. We don't think that's man-centered, but you do. In the same way, we might think it's man-centered for you to think you were picked before you were ever born. Both of us can accuse each other of being man-centered, okay? So it's just meaningless blather. It's just pious looking down your nose and shouting somebody else down like it's playground level argumentation. That's what it is. And I want us to move from the children's table to the adult table and to say, let's leave this kind of rhetoric behind. Let's start by just being brotherly with each other. Just treat each other like you do with Michael Brown. Let's talk to each other like we both actually love each other as Christ calls us to, because, by the way, the Bible says you will know them by how they treat each other. It never says you will know them by their adherence to the tulip systematic or some doctrinal fidelity list. He says you'll know them by how you treat each other. James, can we not treat each other with some level of respect for each other? Thank you, Ray, for your super sticker. I appreciate that. And so I'm just calling us to higher discord when it comes to disagreeing with each other.
And we've done that over and over again. We've done it in debate. And whenever you address, especially Leighton Flowers, you can expect 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours of rambling, normally non sequiturs in response that, just to be honest with you, at my age, I'm not interested in wasting the time listening to all that stuff anymore.
Okay, so I'm not going to listen to that stuff anymore. Keep that in mind. Just mark that and remember it. I'm too old to really want to listen to that anymore, okay? And Leighton does these long videos. So we know the expectation is 7 to 8 hours now. So we're only 17 minutes in, so buckle up. We got about 7 hours left. Okay, so keep those two accusations in mind for later because they're going to come in handy. You'll see what I mean a little later.
But once in a while, a video popped up with Frank Turek, and I just don't understand Frank. So when you hear just horrible misrepresentations of what it is we believe and why we believe it, you have to go, why? What is the motivation?
Okay, so notice the question he's asking. What is the motivation of these provisionists? What are the motivations of Arminians? What is their motivation? What's he doing? He's about to speculate as to what he thinks our motivations are.
And in many instances, it just simply seems to me that the people on the other side, they don't want to listen. The funny thing...
Okay, they don't want to listen. Okay, now, who just now said he's too old to really want to listen anymore? Okay, you can't have your cake and eat it too here, Dr. White. It can't be both. Either I don't want to listen, or I'm doing 7-hour responses to everything you're saying. It can't be both, okay? The fact that I'm doing all these presentations and I'm playing you in your own words, I don't know how better to demonstrate that I'm listening to you, to invite you on my program, to say, let's discuss this. How do I demonstrate more that I'm willing to listen to you than to engage with every single thing you've said about me almost since the time we've had our debate? And you've just now on record said, I don't want to listen to it anymore. And now you're saying the other side doesn't want to listen. Do you see the irony of that? And also notice that you're speculating about what you think the motivation is of the other side, and you give a negative motivation. They just don't care about listening. They don't care about what we have to say, which is exactly the error that you're accusing of Frank Turek of doing in just a minute when he speculates about why Calvinists choose a more deterministic interpretation over another, which we'll get to in a little bit. In other words, both sides can make these kinds of errors, and this is where we've got to be careful.
That's what he's saying about us. Except the vast majority of Reformed people have come out of Yeah, sure. They're Reformed people that were raised within the Reformed tradition, sure. But the vast majority of people came out of a synergistic perspective and abandoned that, and hence know very well what the objections to Reformed theology are.
Okay, so if they come out of synergism into Calvinism, then they should understand perfectly everything that every synergistic scholar has ever said. Is that what you're saying? Of course not. Because there are different kinds of quote-unquote synergists, Arminians, provisionists, and others, just like there are different kinds of Calvinists. And therefore, you're going to run into different arguments regardless of what thought process you've come through. And remember, a lot of people, in my experience at least, are not coming out of a robust, synergistic, Arminian, provisionistic camp. They're coming out of really a place of ignorance where they don't know much about anything. They've just been the John 3:16 kind of Christian, and they just assumed the intuitive reading of the text is that God loves everybody and wants everybody to be saved, and it's your decision to follow him or not. And that's the basic. They don't know the differing interpretive conclusions that people have come to over the years with regard to Romans 9 or Ephesians 1, those kinds of things, which will come up a little later in the discussion as well. So most people, in my experience at least, aren't coming into Calvinism out of a deep, robust understanding of Arminian or provisionistic theology. They're coming out of a basic ignorance, know nothing, whosoever will kind of John 3:16, no, I'm not going to listen kind of mentality into monergism, Calvinism. And so that's the point that I would make. Not many people are converting out of provisionism or true scholarly Arminianism into Calvinism. That typically does not happen. What I'm seeing, the trend is a lot of people who have come from a Calvinistic background are actually becoming provisionist or becoming non-Calvinist because they're recognizing that their scholars haven't been giving them the truth with regard to what the other side actually believes and teaches. And we've demonstrated this, where MacArthur just completely misaligns Arminians in his sermons. And Sproul, saying, they're barely saved, Arminians are barely saved, and these kinds of things. We've shown how the leading Calvinists have treated Arminians and non-Calvinists over the years. And so you can say what you want about me. And by the way, thank you, Susan, for your super chat there. But I guarantee you, I'll hold up how I've treated Calvinists up to any of the leading Calvinists and how they've treated us. How many of them have an open invitation for conversation on their program? How many of them are playing provisionists for themselves and reading their actual words before bringing critique? How many of them are going to the extent that I have gone on my program to represent the other side? And so you say what you want. I'm not perfect. I don't claim to be. But I guarantee you I have done far better than most leading Calvinists have done in representing us. And I think that can be objectively established, in fact.
And those of us that have written on it, Potter's Freedom gives clear evidence of listening very carefully to Norm Geisler's objections, and I think they would be very similar to Frank Turek's. And so
I could also say my hours and hours of rebuttal of your videos gives clear evidence of my willing to listen to and engage with your arguments. So again, some things I think sometimes James White, as well as others, we can all do this. I'm trying not to be accusatory because this is just human frailty. We all make these mistakes. Is that we don't tend to see our own faults. We tend to see the log in other people's eye before we correct the speck in our own. The scripture obviously points that out, and it's just true. We tend to be kind of blind to our own failings, and I recognize this about myself. I tend to judge other people's failings before recognizing my own, and it's only through prayer and reflection and talking to my wife and talking to people who know me really well, saying, "Hey, you do that too sometimes. Remember, you said this and you said that." Oh yeah, okay, yeah, you're right. Okay, I can't be so harsh. And a lot of people ask me, how can you be so kind to James, and how can you be so kind to Calvinists or so mean to you? It's because I recognize myself in them. I'm the same way to people sometimes in my flesh, and I acted that way towards people for a long time, and so I'm a little bit more forgiving because I'm them. I mean, they're just maybe a few years behind me in the process of sanctification, and I recognize that. I like that was me 5 years ago. That was me 10 years ago. Yeah, I acted just like that. I mean, I could kind of. It's the same with my kids. I see myself in my sons. I've got 3 boys and a girl, and I see myself in my sons especially all the time. And I'm able to be I'm a more gracious father to my boys because they're making some of the same mistakes that I made and doing some of the same stupid things that I did. And that's just you can learn grace by being shown grace. Those who have been forgiven much love much. You want to know how I show much love to people who are really seemingly hateful to me, because I've been forgiven much, and I've made a lot worse errors and continue to make errors, and so we're all forgiven. And I think we've got to remind ourselves of that when we're dealing with people who disagree with us.
It's fascinating, and hopefully it'll be useful. It's a short clip. So here is Leighton Flowers, who again talks about the time when he was a Calvinist. He wasn't. I've talked to too many people who knew him at that time. He's never been able to produce any meaningful documentation that he ever understood the Reformed worldview and functioned from it and presented it. He may have thought himself 5-point Calvinist, but he doesn't have a clue what that means. Never was. Just all there is to it.
Okay, so where's his documentation? He's asking for documentation. Where's his? He's saying he met a lot of people. Now it used to be I talked to somebody, and then it became I've met a lot of people. We tend to do that too, don't we? In churches, you'll see this. Oh, everybody's saying, and what that really means is me and my wife were talking about this in the car on the way here, and so I want to substantiate my view by saying, well, everyone's saying this. Thank you, Rich, for your super chat there. That's what we do. That's human nature, to try to make our view sound. And I knew somebody that really, how close could this person have been to me to really know who I am, that they're willing to talk behind my back with you and not talk to me and not tell me about this? Is it somebody that maybe was somebody I associated with through Super Summer, some camping ministry that I met a few times, and maybe was a friend that didn't know me all that well, that had a conversation with you at some conference? Is that your documentation as to what I believed? And what's so difficult about this? I've represented what Calvinists teach on hundreds of programs, and even had Calvinists in debates say, yes, that's what we believe, after I've represented Calvinists. How many times do I have to do that in order for you to say, oh yeah, he gets what Calvinism is? And you want to talk about documentation? Back in 2016, I did a broadcast, and I sent you this broadcast. Of course, you're not wanting to listen because you don't want to go through all my ramblings. I understand that, White. But I have documented this by actually playing audio of back when I was a Calvinistic teacher. And this is from a broadcast that was rebroadcasted on, I wasn't even doing YouTube back then in 2016. And one of our listeners would actually take the audio and put a picture of my face. And I'm not sure where she got this picture. It's much younger, you'll be able to notice on this picture. But she would put my picture up and just play the audio on her YouTube stream, which I appreciated her doing. I gave her permission to do it. But that's what we're about to see. So you're about to hear me. I'm giving you documentation, James White, and all you James White fans who are watching, because I know there's several of you on, because I see you on the side chat. I'm giving you documentation proving that I at least upheld TULIP in the sense of total depravity. You're born unable to willingly or positively respond to the gospel unless you're unconditionally chosen before you're ever born, atoned for, and irresistibly grace. In other words, you're born again, you're regenerated in order to believe so as to persevere to the end. What's hard about that? Am I such a daft human being that I can't understand and adhere to that and teach it in my church? Can you talk to my roommate, Chad Womack, who I debated with for years? He was one of the few people I was not able to convert to Calvinism. He still is a pastor today, just north of here. He has told you, I told you so many times to me. He's texted me several times ago. Yeah, see, I told you so. Several times. He'd post a video of me and say, see, I told you so, because we debated over points that I agree with him about. And so, have you talked to Chad Womack? Have you talked to other guys that Brad Wilson, who I had on the program, I went to college with, he and I debated Arminians together on campus? So, I mean, what other documentation do you need? Let's listen to me back in, well, you'll see. Here we go.
Here is Leighton Flowers, 19, probably, I'm guessing 99, maybe 98. It wasn't marked, but it was an era, so that had been around that time. So here you go.
All right, now we're going to come on a text that's a little bit controversial, but I don't know really why it's so controversial, because it's really plain here. It says very clearly, when the Gentiles heard this, they rejoiced and glorified the message of the Lord, and all who had been appointed to eternal life believed. Now, you can see probably real clearly why people have, conflicted over that particular passage. It clearly indicates that God has appointed those who will have eternal life. Now, I understand some people don't like the doctrine of election, the doctrine of God's choice. Some people just don't want to accept even the plain reading of the text. But it is here that this text tells us that God has appointed certain ones of these individual Gentiles to eternal life. You can't really get around that. Now, there's some people who will try to explain this in different ways, but it's very simple as to what it means. God has appointed certain people to eternal life. We have to accept the mystery of that.
Yeah, I know some people are saying it's hard to hear. It's hard for me to hear because of what I'm saying, the content of what I'm saying, and I know some of you are saying it's hard to hear because of the background noise. It's an old recording, and so I couldn't make it any better. And instead of playing the whole thing, I can maybe put a link in there where you can go try to listen to it for yourself. And if somebody has audio abilities to pull out the background noise or something to make it easier to understand. Anyway, yeah, it's back in the 90s that I was teaching these things, and I'm obviously defending tulip soteriology by appealing to Acts 13 and Ephesians 1 and Romans 9 and these kinds of passages. And so, I mean, that it's the plain, every Calvinist, it's the plain reading of the text, obviously. These kinds of statements were the things I used to believe and adhere to. And I even go on to, in that clip, I can maybe fast forward it just a little bit to where this is me commenting about it after the fact, back when the original broadcast.
Who he wants to say. And sometimes we don't like that. Sometimes we think we should be in control of those kinds of things, when really it's God that is in control. And so we just have to submit to those kinds of texts. Now, let's read on down here.
Now, Calvinists, you can say what you will about whether I was a Calvinist or not, or Calvinistic enough or not for you, or whether I fully understood all of the Reformed, catechisms and doctrinal statements to the degree that you do. You could probably make a good argument that I wasn't all that bright in those days. And I would admit that. I just listened to what I just now said, and I wasn't all that bright back in those days. But
so I wanted you to hear what at least there's documentation. So I've provided my documentation. White, your turn. You provide your documentation. Who's bringing support for their claims? I have documentation demonstrating that I did adhere to the 5 points of Calvinism, at least to some degree, and so. It's your job to substantiate otherwise, if you'd like to. Otherwise, you're just making, again, unsubstantiated, unsupported accusations, and that's not helpful to discussion. In other words, don't debate like that. Don't assume you know something about the person's personal life when you really don't. Don't use hearsay. Somebody told me one time that this is true of Leighton, whatever it may be. Some people are offering that they can clean up the audio for me, and it's online. If I can remember, I'll add that link from that video to the show notes, and maybe we can get it cleaned up so y'all can hear a little bit better as to what I was actually saying. But there at least is some documentation to demonstrate that. All right, here we go.
But he still does the "I'm the former Calvinist" stuff, and it's sort of silly. But
okay, notice he just now said that we reformers, most of us, have come from a synergistic worldview. What is he doing? Oh, see, we're gaining credibility because we were synergists. We know what those synergists believe. We know all the objections, and yet we still became Calvinists. So he's doing the same thing that he's accusing me of doing, trying to gain credibility by claiming we were once something other than we are. Okay? It's just a fact of the matter that I adhered to and taught Calvinism for 10 years. That's just a fact of the matter. It's just a fact of the matter that some people were, quote unquote, synergist or non-Calvinist before they became a Calvinist. That doesn't change anything about the argument. It's, again, to the man. It has nothing to do with the argument that's being brought.
Anyway, let's listen to this and respond to Leighton Flowers and Frank Turek.
Have the motivation for evangelism like I should, right? If that's the case, it might just be easier to say, I can explain this. God just hasn't selected them.
If you have two viable options in front of you, two viable interpretations in front of you, one of which has actually been more popular throughout Christian history among scholars.
Now think about this. It's so loud, I'm having to hold the earpiece like 3 inches from my ear. Leighton wants to do there are lots of ways of interpreting Scripture, you see.
When did I ever say that? When have I ever said there's lots of ways of interpreting Scripture? Just lots of different ways, and all of them are valid and good. Have I said that? No. Do I believe it? No. I've actually used R.C. Sproul's book on proper hermeneutics to demonstrate there is a proper way of doing hermeneutics, to exegete a text. That doesn't change the fact that we're flawed individuals and that some of us are going to follow those that counsel of exegesis, that process of exegesis, and come to a bad conclusion still for whatever reason. And we can speculate as to why. That's what both Frank is doing and White is doing here in these clips, speculating as to why the other side is coming to the wrong conclusion, okay? Even though they're both trying to do the right thing. They're both trying to exegete the Scripture properly, and they're both coming to different conclusions. And so if I acknowledge that two brothers in Christ are striving to exegete the Scripture properly, but coming to differing conclusions, and I'm saying between these two conclusions, if one of them seems to impugn the character of God and the other one doesn't, then it seems like maybe you would side more with the one that doesn't impugn the character of God. Because I'm not saying it doesn't matter how you interpret the Scripture. There's no proper process of interpretation. Of course not. He's accusing me of believing that because that's the only thing I guess he can conclude, because Leighton must be doing improper exegesis because he's coming up with the wrong conclusion, which again is just question begging. We would say the same thing about you. You must have done improper exegesis because apparently you've come up with the wrong conclusion, at least from our estimation, but that's the debate. You can't question beg by just assuming that you're right and I'm wrong. That's just fallacious argumentation. It's playground level argumentation.
And there's no one consistent way. And so now you have Scripture is unclear, and then we can look at church history. Well, remember, Leighton Flowers is a big fan of the Calvinists came from the Manichaean foolishness that we've debunked for quite some time now. And so there's no way to engage. Whenever we've engaged Leighton on church history stuff, it's been embarrassing.
Okay, again, uncharitable. You haven't engaged me in church history. You've engaged my resources in church history because I don't claim to be a church historian. Never claimed it. Matter of fact, I almost went back and found all the clips where I said, well, I'm not a historian. This is not my level of expertise. That's why we have guests on like Dr. Ken Wilson, who is a notable scholar, historical scholar on Augustine's writings. I mean, he's an Oxford graduate. He has an Oxford degree on this subject. I mean, he is the historian. And I quote his resources, or I pull up Calvinistic resources to support my historical findings. So again, he's talking about it's about the man. Leighton is embarrassing. Well, no, you're saying Ken Wilson's embarrassing, or all the sources that I'm citing from Bavinck and Bettner, those are embarrassing apparently, because that's what I've presented for my side of the history. And let's just go back over the facts just real quick. I want to hit on these. Here are the three facts. These are not disputed facts. Well, the last one can be disputed among some Calvinists, but there are sources that support the last point. Let me show you. Augustine was a Manichaean Gnostic for 10 years of his life, at least 10 years, right? That's just a fact of the matter. Even White acknowledges that, okay? Manichaeans taught determinism, okay? Did they teach exactly like Calvinists teach? No. Did they have every single doctrine exactly in line with what Calvinists say about God or how God works? No. But one thing that they did believe was this total inability kind of concept from birth, without the working of the deity to cause you to change your disposition so that you would do what they determined for you to do. In other words, Manichaeans had a deterministic philosophy. That's just a fact of the matter. And we have on record, even Calvinists confessing that's true. Yes, they were determinists. Okay. Does that make, therefore, determinism wrong? No, it's not. That's not the argument. What we're saying is Augustine was a Manichaean Gnostic, and Manichaeanism did hold to determinism and this concept of inability from birth. That concept was within the doctrines of Manichaean philosophy. Okay. Third point, Augustine was the first to teach Calvinistic or deterministic theology in the church. Again, this one may be disputed by someone like White. White might say, no, Augustine wasn't the first one. But we're not getting this from just us being provisionists that are just trying to rewrite history to support our perspective. That's why I've continually brought into the discussion the quotes from the other Calvinists. And I know some of you watching this, you're going, oh, don't read all those again. But remember, new people are tuning in all the time, and some of you just need to hear these things from actual sources, because you can call me embarrassing all you want. Would you call Herman Bavinck embarrassing? Is Herman Bavinck one of the most notable, respected scholars among Calvinists? Is he an embarrassment to you, James White? Because I'm not saying anything that he's not saying with regard to this exact point, okay? In the early church, at a time when it had contended with pagan fatalism and Gnostic naturalism, its representative focused exclusively on the moral nature of freedom and responsibility of humans and could not do justice, therefore, to the teaching of Scripture. Now remember, this is a Calvinist, so he doesn't think they're doing justice to the teaching of Scripture, obviously, because of his bias as a Calvinist. Concerning the counsel of God, though humans had been more or less corrupted by sin, they remained, look what it says, they remained free and were able to accept the proffered grace of God. In other words, the teachings of the early church prior to Augustine taught that man were free and able to accept the proffered grace of God. That was the common teaching among the church. The church's teaching did not include a doctrine of absolute predestination and irresistible grace. That is a Calvinist finding. Is that Calvinist embarrassing you, Dr. White? How about Loraine Bettner? He's the guy who made tulip popular in the 20th century. He's the one who made the acrostic tulip so popular. It may occasion some surprise to discover that the doctrine of predestination, at least the Calvinistic doctrine of predestination, I would add, was not made a matter of special study until the end of the 4th century. They, of course, taught that salvation was through Christ, yet they assumed that man had full power to accept or reject the gospel. Who does that sound like? Sounds like provisionists, doesn't it? We believe that you have the power, the ability to accept or reject the gospel. That's what they taught back then. Some of their writings contain passages which the sovereignty of God is recognized, yet alongside those are others which teach the absolute freedom, the freedom of the human will. Since they could not reconcile the two, they would have denied the doctrine of predestination. In other words, the early church writings denied the doctrine of Calvinistic predestination. They taught a kind of synergism in which there was a cooperation between grace and free will. This cardinal truth of Christianity, this Calvinist says, was first clearly seen by Augustine, a former Manichaean Gnostic. Facts, okay? These are, again, just not opinions that are embarrassing you from Leighton Flowers. These are facts of history that are embarrassing your doctrine, and I think that's part of the problem, okay? In their book, Why I'm Not an Arminian, so you can tell where these guys stand, two Calvinistic professors of theology at Covenant Theological Seminary, Robert Peterson and Michael Williams, they write this, quote, the semi-Pelagians, which we would contend with that label, but nevertheless, the semi-Pelagians were convinced that Augustine's monergistic emphasis on salvation by grace alone represented a significant departure from the traditional teaching of the church. So what are they saying? His doctrine of salvation represented a significant departure from the traditional teaching of the church. And a survey of the thought of the Apostolic Fathers shows that that argument is valid. In other words, what are these Calvinist conclusions? That Augustine departed significantly from the teachings of the church. That is their findings that are embarrassing you, Dr. White. and yet you're saying Leighton Flowers is embarrassing you. No, it's facts are embarrassing you. Historical facts are embarrassing your theology. In comparison, Augustine's monergistic doctrine of grace, the teaching of the apostolic fathers tended toward a synergistic view of redemption. So what are they recognizing? They're recognizing that what I would contend with the monergistic, synergistic labels, but I'm not going to nitpick them at this moment. I'm just going to say, notice that their finding is the apostolic fathers, in other words, all the teachers that we have on record prior to Augustine, taught more of a synergistic view of redemption, synergistic view of salvation, or provisionistic or an Arminian view of salvation, not a Calvinistic one. Louis Berkhoff, again, one of the most respected, quoted theologians in the Calvinistic circles. Okay, those of you who are not Calvinists are going to take my word for it. You can go, you sit in any Reformed circles for any length of time, you're going to hear Bettner quoted, you're going to hear Bavinck quoted, you're going to hear Berkhoff quoted. These are big dogs in their circles. Okay, what does he say? Predestination does not form an important subject of discussion in history until the time of Augustine. Earlier church fathers alluded to it, but do not as yet seem to have very clear conception of it. On the whole, they regarded it as a prescience of God, prescience or foreknowledge of God with reference to human deeds, on the basis of which he determines their future destiny. It would be unreasonable to look for a common, definite, well-integrated, and fully developed view of the application of the work of redemption in the earliest church fathers. Their representations are naturally rather indefinite, imperfect, and incomplete, and sometimes even erroneous and self-contradictory. Says Canas, it stands as an assured fact, a fact knowing no exceptions, that acknowledged by all well-versed in the matter, that all, listen to what he's saying, is well-versed. Everybody who knows anything about this should know this. This is from Berkhoff, okay? All of the pre-Augustinian fathers taught that in the appropriation of salvation, there is a co-working of freedom and grace. So in other words, who's embarrassing you, James White? History is embarrassing you. Berkhoff is embarrassing you by telling you that anyone who knows anything about this knows that all the pre-Augustinian fathers taught a synergistic, a co-working of freedom and grace. Okay? Berkhoff goes on to admit that, quote, they do not hold to an entire corruption of the human will and consequently adhere to a synergistic theory of regeneration. In other words, there were no monergists, there were no Calvinists. I know that's anachronistic, obviously, reading back into history. There were no teachers of these doctrines prior to Augustine. Okay. Who is embarrassing you? Berkhoff is embarrassing you. Those Arminian scholars that wrote that book against Arminianism, they're embarrassing you. Bettner is embarrassing you. Bavinck is embarrassing you. Leighton Flowers is just reporting. You decide. Okay. That's why these kinds of things are so important for you to address not the person, but the argument. Instead of saying Leighton is embarrassing himself, face planting, all these kinds of things, deal with what I actually am saying. Deal with what Berkhoff said. Deal with the facts of history. And then we can actually get somewhere in our discussion. All right.
For Leighton, he doesn't know church history, and he's made...
No, you're right. Okay, whoa. Dang it. Reset it. You're right. Let's just pretend he is absolutely right. I don't know anything about church history. I'm a doofus. I'm drooling on my keyboard as we speak. Does that have anything to do with what Berkhoff said? Does it have anything to do with what Ken Wilson has written? Does it have anything to do with all of these other quotes? No. That's a to-the-man ad hominem argument. Instead of addressing the argument, what's he do? Leighton is embarrassing. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a doofus. Okay? That's not an argument. That's a fallacy. And I don't remember where we left off. Sorry. Let me see if I can find it.
Leighton knows he cannot refute Ephesians 1. He's tried. And
that's, I think, a little later there. Dadgum, I hate when I do that.
Okay. That's an argument for our side.
I don't think we're there yet.
Remember, Leighton Flowers is a big fan of the Calvinists came from the Manichaean foolishness that we've debunked for quite some time now. And so there's no way to engage. Whenever we've engaged Leighton on church history stuff, it's been embarrassing for Leighton. He doesn't know church history, and he's made incredible mistakes regarding church history. But there is no question that, depending on how you define church history, in the broad spectrum of things, There is no question of the fact that man-centered religion is far more popular amongst men than...
Is it far more popular among regenerate men? Because that's the argument. The argument is not it's far more popular among men in general. The argument is it's far more popular among people who profess faith in Christ. So notice a little shift there he did. So what he's trying to do is to claim this as a support for his worldview. Of course, man-centered doctrine is going to be more popular because these are men-centered people. Really? Regenerate, born-again Christians are man-centered. Why? Because God determined them to be? God determines his own children to be man-centered? How does that make any rational sense? Does he answer that question? No, he mocks it. And so that's why we push back on these things for Dr. White to say, how does that argument make sense within your actual worldview? It just doesn't.
And a theological understanding of God's sovereignty and man's inability outside of the sovereign grace of God. No argument about that at all. But that's an argument for our side. Okay? That's an argument for our side. There is no question that God's truth regarding his sovereignty over his people has to...
And when he says sovereignty, he means determinism. So we all believe God has sovereignty over his people. Okay. He believes sovereignty means determinism. In other words, what he's saying, again, same vocabulary, different dictionary, what he's saying, what's he meaning to say, whether he'll come out right out and say it, is that men don't like the idea that God determines everything we do, including rape and murder. And yes, he's right about that. But not only do unbelievers think that that's really, really horrible, but Christians, born-again believers, don't like that. Okay, and he's saying that's for our side because it's just natural that people would reject this concept of God controlling all things and making all things that come to pass through divine decree. Thank you, Simple Agape Project. Appreciate that. Isn't Calvinism doctrine of election a different gospel? Plus, if Calvinists are taking over your church, don't wear your context calls Calvinism. Love you, Brother Tim. Yeah. And we've talked about that in other episodes, and so just for the sake of time, I'll refer you to some of those that we've talked about. Well, this is not a debate over the gospel. Calvinism is not the gospel. We can all both adhere to the gospel proclamation and the truths of the gospel and still debate over soteriological differences within the faith. All right, continue on.
Be reiterated over and over again because the tendency of man is to always insert himself into the glory of God.
Okay, the tendency of man is to always insert himself into the determinism of God. Okay, that's what he's saying. Why? Because God determined it. You can't have it both ways, James White. You're griping and complaining about the tendency of man to insert themselves in the determinism of God while asserting that God determines everything, including that very tendency that you're griping about. Who are you, O man, to question God's determination of men to have that tendency? Do you not see how utterly counterintuitive these doctrines are? You're complaining about the very thing that you're claiming that God determined, and it's self-refuting.
And so we have to hammer away on, it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves.
Why do you have to hammer away on it? As if they have free will and you can convince them? What are you hammering away on? Are you hammering away on God stopping them from doing that tendency? Because you believe that God determines the tendency, and you believe that you have to hammer away at them to make them stop that tendency. Why not hammer away at God, telling God to stop decreeing them to be that way? Again, it's self-refuting. Vertigo sets in, as William Lane Craig talks about, when you really begin to unpack the claims of the deterministic system and their insistence that we have to hammer away against the tendency of man, while at the same time believing that tendency is determined to be what it is by God. And thus you've got ultimately God playing both sides. God's playing the side of the Arminian and the side of the Calvinist and the provisionist and all in between. He's ultimately determining the arguments of every single person, making this entire thing a fruitless, irrational discussion in the first place.
It is the gift of God, not of works, as any man should boast, because we have the tendency of boasting.
We have the tendency of boasting. Why? Because God decrees whatsoever comes to pass on Calvinism. So we have the tendency to boast. Now, notice what he's doing here. He's speculating as to what the motivation is of the synergist, the Arminian, the provisionist, as he calls them, synergist, right? So he's about to get on to Frank for misrepresenting Calvinist motivations, but yet what has he done? The other side won't listen, and they want to boast. They're man-centered, and they want to boast. So what has he done? He has speculated, wrongly in our estimation, about what he thinks our motivations are, which is exactly what he's going to get on to Frank for doing here in a little bit.
That's our argument, and he doesn't even seem to realize that. Like I said, if he had ever actually been reformed, he would understand that. Again, I have no reason to believe whatsoever that he ever was. But there you go.
Namely, the view that we hold to, the more free will perspective, if you will, has always been more popular throughout church history than the more predestinarian or the deterministic kind of interpretations. If you have both of those in front of you, and you're actually studying the best of both scholars from both sides, why would you choose the one that seems to make God the author of sin, that seems to impugn his character, that seems to possibly undermine other very strong texts that indicate God's frustration for when we don't choose to follow him? And
so once again, you have this. There isn't. Leighton knows he cannot refute Ephesians 1. He's tried and has just face-plantingly failed at the process.
What does that do for you, Dr. White? You've pulled my pigtail on the merry-go-round. Ouch. Okay, now can we discuss my actual published work refuting your belief that predestination is about individuals being predestined to be believers in Ephesians 1, when it actually says that God has predestined those who are in him to be holy and blameless? Can we talk about that instead of pulling my pigtails and running away going, ha, ha, ha? I mean, that's the kind of stuff. This is playground level argumentation. And we need to take the discussion to the adult table and stop with this silly nonsense and throwing stones at each other and trying to one-upsmanship. Oh, I'm so much better than this guy, and it's just embarrassing the way he's acting. It's just so bad. Even though I said almost the exact same things as your friend Michael Brown. Would you say any of those things to Michael Brown? It's just embarrassing how he believes about Ephesians 1. He believes the same thing about Ephesians 1 that I do, from what I've read. Is he embarrassing too? Why don't you go pull his pigtails? Why don't you go pull his pigtails for a while on the merry-go-round, Dr. White?
And you saw what happened with Romans 9 and Romans 8 and all the so
yeah,
what you,
and why he talks about Romans 9. I'm the first one who published the Romans 9 debate on my broadcast. I had the video up on my broadcast a month before he did. And by the way, mine's the better one to watch because it actually puts the slides on the screen, whereas his doesn't, which makes a big difference because it shows which verses I'm commenting on instead of reading the text and commenting. And to save time, I put the verses up on the screen. So a lot of people aren't following my argument unless you see the screen. So watch it from Sociology 101 if you're going to watch the debate, because you can see my slides that I use. He doesn't use slides, I do. And so I was proud of my first public debate, theological debate. And I still am. I still think that we made some valid points that need to be heard, and I like for people to see that. So why some Calvinists just watch the Romans 9 debate. Aha, got you there. I'm like, okay, yeah, please watch the Romans 9 debate, because it does demonstrate, I think, very clearly some of the misconceptions of the Calvinists with regard to the nature of God in dealing with the nation of Israel versus individuals. And they read individuals into when Paul is dealing with the hardening of Israel, and they assume the hardening of Israel is really about reprobation of individuals. And I think in that debate, that's demonstrated very clearly. So I would appreciate you watching that. Thank you, Melissa, for your super chat there. All right, moving on.
you have to do is you have to go, well, there are equally valid interpretations, you see. And not equally. Now,
Now, I've never said they're equally invalid interpretations. Otherwise, if they're equally valid interpretations, then I'm saying this is a valid interpretation. It's correct, in other words, and this one is also correct. And then I would be committing the law of contradiction. No, there's not two correct interpretations. There can be two people who are well-intending, trying to follow the proper mode of exegesis and coming to two different conclusions. Why? Because we have free will. Because we're flawed individuals, okay? And your answer is, no, these two people who are both regenerate, born again, following these methods of interpretation come to wrong conclusions because God decreed them to. And if that's not irrational, I don't know what is. Why God would decree one of his own children to come to a false theology or false doctrine for his own glorification is so intuitively false. I don't need to make an argument against it. I just need to make sure people understand that's what Calvinism entails, is that God ordains his own children to use hermeneutics to come to a false conclusion and to teach it. He actually ordains and decrees and brings that to pass for his own glorification. That is absurd in my estimation. And I have yet to hear James White actually address that argument. Selhammer, thank you for your super chat. Thanks for refuting poor arguments. You've encouraged me. Thank you, brother or sister. Thank you for that. And thank you, Jamie, for your super chat. If I miss super chats or questions, I'm not meaning to, just have a lot to discuss here, so I'm trying to move along.
Now he'll point to this person's interpretation over there and this person's interpretation over there, but then they'll disagree with each other on all sorts of things. There is one consistent interpretation on these issues on the other side that is consistent with the nature of God. Now remember, Leighton was the one who just recently was saying, yeah, the Southern Baptists should never have gotten rid of the open theist. You know, it's a perfectly valid philosophical speculation and discussion and blah, blah, blah. And we've been saying forever and a day, you know, it's just so obvious where he is and where he's going to end up. There's just, it's so plain to anybody watching it.
Okay, so what he's critiquing here is my audacity to actually let other scholars speak into these issues. That's what he's, he'll get a scholar over here and he'll get somebody over here that disagrees. He'll listen to an Arminian and actually have an Arminian on his program, and he'll get a Calvinist over here. He'll get an annihilationist on his program over here, and he'll get a dynamic perspective guy on his program over here. We can't educate. We've got to indoctrinate, guys. We've got to shut out all those other views out there and just get the people who line up with us and just believe like we do. That seems to be what he's doing here. And heaven forbid you have anybody who disagrees with you on your program on some other matter because, guilt by association. He's just like those people, those bad people we've already deemed as heretics, and he's just like one of them. We all know that's where he's going. He's going to become just like one of them. And it's just, again, this is a way not to debate. The guilt by association stuff, these kinds of ways of debating are not productive. Seth, thank you for your super chat. He's saying, could we say that God determined before the creation of the world that Leighton would destroy James White's arguments without a hint of malice or anger? Well, I would like to hear, besides just the mocking of that argument as to why God would determine Leighton Flowers to do this program, I would like to hear an actual argument instead of just going, I can't believe you said that, or I don't have to answer that question. Give a rational explanation as to why God determines his own kids to produce false theology, if indeed that's what you believe is happening.
But then you get these arguments. Well, it impugns his character. I think creating a universe filled with purposeless evil is the greatest impugning of God's character ever. And as soon as you throw back at that, well, we're not, and you can't get the.
Okay, remember we responded to the. Remember me saying purposeless. I couldn't say purposeless very well. Y'all remember all of that? So did we listen? In other words, he accused us of not listening. Well, we listened. We responded to all of that. In fact, we even wrote an article addressing this whole concept with the purposeless evil. And we gave a clear and direct answer to his arguments, quoting from him and giving explanation using Matt Slick as also one who believed like he does. And then I quoted from Matt Strider, which I says I wrote this. It's obvious. I quoted Matt Strider writing this, I should say. Okay, it is obvious both Matt Slick and James White are committing the logical fallacy of a false dilemma. Namely, they are insisting that there exists only two alternatives or solutions to a problem when in fact there are other valid options to be considered. And so, in other words, what they're saying is either God determines moral evil or it's purposeless. It just happens for no reason whatsoever. And it's just purpose. No purpose at all. Logical fallacies confound the issue, and at times they can convince unsuspecting listeners of an argument's validity. This approach is very similar to the fallacious questions asked by Calvinists regarding the boastworthiness of the libertarian decision in salvation. But I assure you there is not much substance behind either of these baseless arguments. Let's unpack it. What Calvinists fail to acknowledge is that in our system, evil is a consequence of autonomous human freedom, something they presume cannot exist, libertarian free will, in other words. And in fact, we do believe that God does have a purpose in giving man the ability to make autonomously free choices or libertarianly free choices. So it is only in presuming that God did not purpose to create autonomous creatures that one is left with the dilemma of either God purposing evil or purposeless evil. I believe clear distinction must be made in the idea of God actively purposing evil and actively using evil for his good purpose. That's the key right there. There's a big difference between God purposing evil, because evil does have a purpose. It's evil. That's why it's not of God, okay? So there's a big difference between saying God purposes, causes, brings about evil, and saying that it's purposeless. I believe a clear distinction must be made in the idea of God actively purposing evil, causing it, and actively using evil for his good purpose. We believe God can and does use evil, the freely chosen evil of creatures, for his good purpose. We do not believe he actually tempts or causes the evil itself. That's the difference between our two worldviews. And that laid out very clearly, and there's much more there. I'm not going to read it all for sake of time for this purpose, but I do want you to be aware of it. All right, moving on.
You can't get them to commit. He won't. He's so wishy-washy on his actual doctrine of God that it's, well, that's a good thought over there. And all he can say is, but what we can't say is what the Calvinist says. He can't tell you positively what actually to believe.
Again, I'm not wishy-washy. I've got a book on the subject where I've quoted from C.S. Lewis, a well-known, well-established apologist, on my views with regard to these things. I have a book that talks about the doctrine of God and his character. It doesn't even mention Calvinism in the bulk of the book. It is a positive presentation of provisionism. Not very big books. And I want you to keep that in mind, because remember, he says we're not willing to listen. Has he read my books? It's not that long. It wouldn't be that hard to read. Keep that in mind as you listen to this, because he's going to give Frank some advice later, and I want to see if he's willing to take it for himself.
But what we can't say is that we just have to be, we have to redefine grace and make grace dependent upon man's responses and all the rest of the stuff that we've spent years documenting. We're not going to go back over it again. But this is setting up a real straw man situation. And Dr. Turek's response should be, well, I'm not really sure that's an accurate way of putting things, but when you're on somebody else's show, frequently you don't get that.
And the wrath of God and the punishment of God for doing things that he's supposedly determined for you to do that you couldn't help.
I don't know why
Yeah.
I was going to say, I don't know why they choose it, Leighton. I can speculate. It might be because it's easier.
Okay, now notice, some can accuse Frank of not being real charitable here, and I can understand that accusation, because he does speculate, and he speculates badly in the sense of he assumes a negative reason for why they're coming to their conclusions. But he does say he's speculating, and he's going to reiterate that fact here in a minute. Just like he's speculated about us, well, we want to boast, and we're man-centered, and we're not willing to listen. So White has just speculated as to why we won't listen, or why we won't come to his side and believe what he teaches. And now that's exactly what Frank Turek is doing. He's speculating as to why the Calvinist picks the deterministic interpretation over the other interpretations. And he even admits it's a speculation. Okay? Now, moving on. Listen to what Frank says.
Right. And it might easier in the sense that well, look, these people are just on their way to hell. There's nothing I can do about it. I'll throw a Bible verse at them, see if maybe they'll respond. I don't know if they're elect or not, but gee, if they don't respond, I guess they're just not elect. So I don't really have the motivation for evangelism like I should, right? If that's the case, it might just be easier to say, I can explain this. God just hasn't selected them. But and it also makes me feel better. Well, he selected me, right? He selected me, and I don't really have any free choice in it. But gee, I'm pretty special now.
Now, this kind of straw man is just reprehensible, Dr. Turek. You just
And again, I would say it's no different than saying it's because you won't become Calvinist because you're not willing to listen, because you want to boast in your own salvation, because you don't know the Bible very well. Because remember, that's what Steve Lawson says when he's asked, why aren't more Christians Calvinists? He says, because they don't know their Bible and because they're prideful. What is that? You're speculating about the motivations that led these people to a bad conclusion. The problem is that on your view, your God, your version of what God is and has done, has God determining us to be prideful and have lack of Bible knowledge and not willing to listen to you, and our tendency towards being boasting and all these kinds of things. So you have God to blame, ultimately, if the implications of your system are true, for how we're reacting to your doctrines. We don't have that problem on our side. When we accuse you of making errors, and assuming you're really wrong, okay, so because remember, that's what we're doing here. When Frank and I are talking, we're assuming Calvinism is an error, okay? Just like you do when you talk about us. So assuming Calvinism is an error, what could be some of their bad motivations to lead them there? Well, maybe it's easier for them. It takes the pressure off. I've actually heard Calvinists not put it in the way Frank did. Frank was obviously presenting it in a negative fashion towards an accusation towards the Calvinists. But I've heard Calvinists say, I loved when I became a Calvinist because it took the pressure off of me, because I didn't have to convince anybody to be a Christian. I didn't have to try to persuade them anymore. I could let that be to God. I'd give that all over to God. I've heard them say that. And that's exactly, in essence, what Frank is kind of arguing there. I've also heard, by the way, Calvinists say things like, man, it was so overwhelming to realize that God picked me. I was like, wow. And that's just amazing. God really picked me. That's, in essence, what he just said. Now, he put it in a negative fashion of saying, hey, you're special now, and it makes it sound like you would boast in being special, but you're accusing us of boasting because we admit that we're sinners and we believe we have actual responsibility. And so he's doing the same to you, speculating as to why you might come to a wrong conclusion. In other words, both sides are doing the same thing to each other here. And yet both of them are, accusing the other of being uncharitable. Nathan, thank you for your super chat. Found you through Frank's video that James is so poorly critiquing. When's the best next video to ask a cold, open verse question on John 20? Thanks so much for your ministry, sir. Yeah, we do have question and answer times occasionally, and so maybe we can get to one of those. But I appreciate your super chat. Maybe we'll get to some of those. And I think I do have something on John 20, but I have to look it up. So give me some time on that.
I don't know who you're trying to convince here. You're certainly not reaching anyone who's reformed, because we know.
He's not trying to convince anybody, as far as I'm concerned. As far as I can tell, he's answering my question, because I'm speculating, assuming Calvinism is wrong, and you got these two interpretations set in front of you. What would be the motivation for them choosing this presumably wrong interpretation? Well, here's a couple of options. Here's a couple of things that may draw people to accept that worldview. It may not be true of you, but he says he's speculating. And that seems to be all he's doing here. He's just speculating as to why Calvinists might choose that interpretation over the other.
That this thing is getting close to the same conflagration that we saw behind Doug Wilson in today's video. You get this award today, Dr. Turek. You are strawmanning badly, and you're demonstrating a fundamental level of ignorance.
And of course, we would say the same thing. You're demonstrating a fundamental level of ignorance about provisionists or Arminians when you say that the reason we believe what we believed is because of pride, or because we're not willing to listen to you, or we don't know our Bibles, as often as accusation from the Calvinist against us. And so basically the same thing is being done back and forth. And the reason I'm doing this video is, here's how not to debate theology, is we don't need to assume the nefarious intention of our brothers. I don't have to think that they're just being lazy and it's just easier for them or something like that. And by the way, you'll hear my answer to Frank here, and I actually kind of indicate that in my answer to him. Because he's a guest on my program, and you'll hear my answer. And so you don't have to assume the nefarious intention of the other person as if they're a sneaky snake or they're bad. And I'm not saying Frank's saying that about Calvinists. Again, he's speculating as to why they would be choosing the supposedly wrong interpretation, because we're both non-Calvinist, and we are talking as both non-Calvinists, presuming the Calvinistic interpretation is the wrong one, obviously.
And you all are on Erasmus's side. You're on the Roman side against the Reformation.
Okay, and this skipped ahead a little bit just because he kind of told some stories there, and I just moved ahead. Remember, just keep in mind that Erasmus was also a reformer. He was a reformer that wanted to reform from within, and Luther was a reformer that wanted to separate, a separatist. The Protestant is the one that wanted to separate from Rome. So Erasmus was trying to reform some of the ills of Rome as well. I'm not trying to say everything Erasmus taught was right. I don't agree with everything Erasmus taught. But just because Erasmus happened to believe more like we do with regard to free will doesn't make the Protestant Reformation hinge upon this issue, because it doesn't. Luther might have seen it that way, but Luther is not the end-all be-all of the Reformation, because he's not the only mover and shaker that brought about the Reformation. There were people long before Luther came on the scene that were reforming the ills of the Catholic Church. And we get into that. Well, listen to what he says first, and then I'll present some stuff.
I hope you weren't dressing up as Martin Luther or anything yesterday, because y'all are on the other side of the chasm. You are opposed to the Reformation. You're not a part of the Reformation. I know Leighton's tried to get around that. Again, another face-plantingly bad attempt.
Okay, so let's look at my face-plantingly bad attempt, whatever that is. This is a portion of that article that supposedly face-planted, that the way in which James White, if y'all remember correctly, the way in which James White pointed out my faceplant was demonstrating that I didn't know how to pronounce Melanchthon because I put an M at the end of it instead of an N. That was his rebuttal. Go listen to it. He doesn't read the words of Melanchthon. He doesn't actually deal with my quote from Melanchthon. He just simply says, Leighton obviously didn't listen in class because he doesn't even know how to pronounce his name correctly. That is your great theologian, apologist. He got me there. Oh wow! You forgot one of the bumps at the end of his name. You added a bump there. We shouldn't even consider your argument now. That's the level of the faceplant that he's pointing out. The simple fact is that not all reformers held to 5-point Calvinistic soteriology being popularized today. Little attention, for instance, is given to the influence of the Protestant Anabaptist or Christian Brethren movement, which flourished in Germany, Austria, Netherlands, and other countries during the 16th century. Anabaptists were most notably associated with the doctrine of adult believers' baptism, the separation of church and state, and voluntary church membership. But history reveals that their soteriology, as it developed, was anything but Calvinistic. While there was no direct link from Anabaptists to the growth of the Baptist churches in England, it was very likely that the latter were influenced in their beliefs and the attitudes by the former. But even if we were to limit our historical studies to the inner circle, at the heart of what was popularized as the Reformation's beginnings, one cannot overlook the Reformed theologian Philip Melanchthon. And Melanchthon, I'll say the N extra harsh there. That way you can actually deal with his argument this time instead of my mispronunciation of it. An influential friend of both Martin Luther and John Calvin, Melanchthon accepted an invitation to become the University of Wittenberg's, I probably mispronounced Wittenberg, so I may get railed on for that too, but I think that's right. He's a professor of Greek, where he worked closely with the other more notable reformers. Melanchthon went on to publish the Theological Commonplaces, the first systematic treatment of the Reformed thought in the Augsburg Confession, a popular statement later to be endorsed by the Lutheran Church. Modern Calvinistic scholars understandably highlight the role of men like Luther, given his treatise, The Bondage of the Will. But Melanchthon, the arguably more accomplished scholar, is often overlooked, and Calvin, though a close friend, took great issue with Melanchthon's soteriology, as would most Calvinistic scholars today. Melanchthon affirmed a more corporate approach to the doctrine of predestination, while rejecting the typical Calvinistic view that God predetermines to save some individuals to the neglect of the rest. For instance, Melanchthon wrote, here's the actual quote that he neglected to actually play. Why? Because it didn't serve his purpose. It embarrassed him. The history, actual facts of history, embarrassed his doctrine and his view. So he doesn't deal with that. Instead, he focuses on something that embarrasses the person, Leighton Flowers, i.e., I can't pronounce his name correctly. Okay? So that's where White likes to focus. You shouldn't debate that way. You should just say, oh, well, he mispronounced his name, but here's the quote. Let's get to it. Okay? The eternal fate of the individuals was in their own hands at the moment when they heard the Spirit illuminated gospel promises. Altogether, therefore, the choice for the saving faith in Jesus had three origins: the Word, the Spirit, and the individual free will, end quote. That's Philip Melanchthon, arguably by even Luther's own estimation, the greater of the scholars. He was the Greek professor there at Wittenberg, okay? This guy had more credentials than Luther did and was instrumental in the Reformation, even among those circles outside the Anabaptists and outside the other groups that I already mentioned, okay? No scholar worth his salt could make the case that Philip Melanchthon was not a significant 16th century biblical scholar who deserves at least as much recognition for his role in the Reformation as the likes of Calvin, Zwingli, and even Luther. In fact, Robert Kolb's research demonstrates that the majority of expositors followed Melanchthon rather than Luther in saying that Romans 9, while not exalting human merit, does not deny general atonement that human beings must appropriate by free decision. These included former students of Melanchthon, and I'll list them there. So again, this is not, I'm not the historian here. Notice all the little the footnotes. I'm quoting from other people who are historians. So this is not about Leighton being embarrassing by mispronouncing a name. This is about Leighton's work to actually look at the actual history, and that actual history is what embarrasses James White. And I think that's why he treats me the way he does, is because I'm pulling out historical facts that embarrass his theology, and therefore he treats me the way he does, I think. To deny those of us in the soteriological line of men like Melanchthon the Reformed label on the basis of our theological differences is not only historically inaccurate, but it's somewhat insulting. I also quote from Robert Olson earlier in this article that gives some more history on that if you're interested in it. Before moving on, I did want to say, Franco, thank you for your super chat. You write, is White trying to play on your tendency, that is, follow the herd, by your tendency that you said you came out of Calvinism because of the Louis Tozer? Is James White playing on you from the open theism boogeyman by trying to make open theism plagiarism? Yeah, and we've talked about that before, his tendency to kind of dismiss me with the Pelagian label, those kinds of things. It's the same kind of thing that we're seeing again, it seems like to me anyway.
Because on the first written debate of the Reformation, this entire video is on the side of Erasmus against Luther. That's just a fact. So I don't know who you're trying to convince here. Maybe you're just trying to.
So should we go find one of the discussions about infant baptism versus believer's baptism and Zwingli killing Hubmaier and his wife for believing in believer's baptism? That was an early debate too in the history of the Reformation. You're not Reformed because you don't believe in infant baptism, obviously. You see the level of that argumentation, right? That's the kind of thing. By the way, Zwingli was called a Pelagian by Luther. So, I just think that's funny. Adam Harwood, in my interview with him just a few weeks ago when he was here, showed me that, where Luther actually accused Zwingli of being a Pelagian because he has a different view of the inherited guilt issue. I just thought that was really, really, really funny. Okay, moving on.
Cheer up the troops. They're already convinced that we need to avoid talking to those Calvinists or listening to what those Calvinists are saying, whatever. But for those of us who are listening to this is just another example of, here you go with more evangelicals that just have no earthly idea what it is we're saying. They're not listening, and that's a shame.
Okay, I'm speculating. I'm not a Calvinist, so I don't know what's in their head.
So notice he just now he's he's saying, I don't know what's in their head. He's speculating. Hey, I'm guessing, why are these people coming to the wrong conclusions? We obviously suppose that they're being wrong because we're both provisionists here. And he's saying, I don't know. I mean, that's not that uncharitable. It's certainly not as uncharitable as what you're being towards him by saying that he's not willing to listen, that he's wanting to boast, he's prideful, he doesn't really know his Bible, all those kinds of accusations that people throw at us for coming to the supposedly wrong conclusions. So again, I'm just putting things into perspective here.
Yeah, I'm not a Calvinist. I don't know what's in their head. That's the problem. You could know if you wanted to. Let me point something out. We tend to write books.
Yeah. So
there are lots
right?
of memes out there about, you you can't afford seminary, get into an argument with the Calvinist and he'll lecture you forever for free.
That's true.
That kind of thing. And it's true. So, again, there's no reason for you to be sitting there going, well, I'm just speculating. I don't know.
And you don't have to speculate as to why we choose what we choose either. You don't have to speculate that I'm just trying to boast or I'm prideful, don't know my Bible. You don't have to assume anything of those. You can actually read what we write too. You see how the shoe fits on both sides here? Both of them are speculating as to why the other one has come to the wrong conclusions, assuming, of course, they've come to the wrong conclusion. And neither one is going to be happy with those speculations.
When the documentation demonstrates your speculation is not only based on ignorance, but it's based upon a rejection of the easily available, obvious information that if you just take the time to look at it, you might not say this kind of stuff.
Maybe it might be that they've never heard the other side. That could be the case.
Yeah, no. I mean, I honestly can't think. I'm trying here. I cannot think of any Reformed person that is in such a cave that they have not heard. I mean, using the same example, one of the things that I do when I'm in town at Apologia, I did Sunday, is we have a catechism question in the bulletin. I think we're on question 35 on effectual calling right now. And man, it's a rich question. And the answer's really, really deep on monergism and the role of the Spirit. And so what I do is I go through pretty much phrase by phrase with the response and then the verse that we memorize and make sure that as we're memorizing this, we're not just memorizing things by rote, but we understand its relevance. And over the years, I've been there heading for 5 years now. I have repeatedly explained to people why it is that people struggle with the things that we're saying. What are the views of those people out there? And I don't have to misrepresent them. There's no reason to. The more
when I heard this, I was just like, oh my gosh, he is so unaware of his lack of representation with regard to provisionists especially. How many times on those hours of response videos that he doesn't want to listen to because of his age apparently, have we corrected his misrepresentations of both Arminians and Calvinists? And I've got good Arminian friends and good provisionist friends, scholars on both sides, some of the scholars who have published some of the leading books out there that are to be, who have told me the exact same. He completely misrepresents Arminians and provisionists on his program and his broadcast. I can only imagine that he's doing the same thing to whoever he's teaching on Sunday morning in these catechism classes.
Clearly and fully and accurately you represent.
But let me put something in here. Instead of just blanket statements of he doesn't ever represent us correctly, in those hour-long videos that he already acknowledged that I put out there, I demonstrate that. So I'm not just giving a blanket accusation like you'll hear White do of me, where he just says, Leighton's using these fallacies, or Leighton doesn't understand Reformed theology, or Leighton never represents for Reformed theology. He never actually says, okay, here is where Leighton said something, and here is why it's a misrepresentation, okay? He doesn't demonstrate how it's a misrepresentation and why it's a misrepresentation. He just claims that it is. Blankets. This is what I'm talking about, unsubstantiated accusations. broad brush statements, those kinds of things. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're saying not to do when you're debating theology.
The other side, the more devastating your critique and answer can be, and the more useful to the people.
That's true. When you still man your opponent and then you tear down the still man instead of straw man your opponent and burn the straw man, when you use the very best of the scholars and you refute their claims, that is a much better and more sound argument. I agree with that. I don't think White has a history of doing that with Arminians or provisionists at all. And that's what's so ironic about this statement of his, is that I, in my experience, have yet, and again, go back to listen to his stuff with me on John 6 and things like that, where he says things that he'll even say, well, I'm not sure Leighton's view on this, and I don't know, even though it's published right there in clear black and white and stuff like that. Well, and then he'll go back and later he'll say, oh, okay, I see Leighton saying this. In other words, he's discovering things as he's going on with us about some of my views on these subjects. Like he's never encountered them before. There's several broadcasts that we have demonstrated that. And yet he's claiming, he's trying to make the argument, oh, we understand the other side. We understand, we get it. The whole point that Frank and I are making is a lot of people are coming into Calvinism out of more of a bed of ignorance of the doctrines. And they may be a whosoever will kind of a John 3:16 non-Calvinist because they don't know anything about the doctrines, but they're not coming into Calvinism out of a scholarly, robust provisionist or Arminian, understanding of the text. At least that's not been my experience.
So as I'm going through effectual calling, I'm talking about, okay, this is where people are coming from, and this is how the gospel's presented, and you don't have an effectual call because that's a work of the Spirit of God doing these certain things. For example, the phrase I looked at Sunday was enlightening their minds with the knowledge of Christ. This is something that has to come from outside of us.
Do we agree with that, by the way? Just asking. Yes. We believe that God has to enlighten us. How does he do that? By means of inspiration of the Scripture, proclamation of God's word. In other words, God uses means to enlighten us. What the Calvinist says is that's not enough. He has to do all those things to enlighten us through inspiration of the Scriptures and the proclamation of the word, sending the preacher who's inspired by God and filled by the Holy Spirit. He has to do all of that, and he has to do some other supernatural working of some sort to make the person understand and believe it irresistibly. And so that's where sometimes men like James White get us wrong, because they critique us as if we don't believe that God has to enlighten us. We don't believe God has to bring the light and revelation. And that's just not true. Again, that's a misrepresentative. It's a straw man, if you will. If you want to hold up a straw man, that would be a straw manning of the provisionist perspective.
And I'll talk about what synergists like yourself believe about man anthropologically. Now, by the time we're question 35, the Catechism, we've already dealt with the deadness of man and sin and things like that, obviously. But this is a part of what we do. We make sure that people accurately understand. And again, many of them have come from that, but that's a part of being truthful in how you deal with these issues. And it would help a lot if we all attempted to do that.
Maybe they haven't tuned into Soteriology 101.
Yeah. Well, I think now that's just being rude, because all Frank is saying is they haven't got educated on what provisionists actually teach. And that's true. A lot of people only know what Leighton Flowers teaches based upon what James White told them Leighton Flowers teaches. They haven't actually tuned in to Leighton Flowers. And what have I said? I've produced many videos saying it's only proper, it's only fair for you to learn Calvinism from a Calvinist. I have documents of me saying that over and over and over again in almost all my presentations. When I do a live public presentation, I will almost always start my tulip presentation with, it's only fair for you to learn Calvinism from a Calvinist. And I'll recommend R.C. Sproul's book, Chosen by God, or something like that. Because I think that's what's fair. That's what's reasonable, right? Because in order to have an education, you should actually look at various scholars. Listen to my interview with Adam Harwood. That's exactly the point he and I spend a lot of time making about his actual systematic. Because his systematic is gathering all the scholars and synthesizing that in his systematic to demonstrate these are the different approaches that have been taken throughout Christian history. And it talks about an education versus an indoctrination. Okay. And what does White do? He just laughs at it. He laughs at the idea that someone might actually tune in and listen to someone who disagrees with him.
If back when I was a Calvinist, I would think it was probably the latter. I hadn't really been introduced to the other side, and therefore I adopted that.
Again, I hadn't been introduced to the other side. Really?
Okay, so I'm not sure why he's face planting here on this. I'm actually kind of speaking up for the Calvinist here in this response. I'm saying, Frank, I don't think it's because they're lazy or they're trying to take the easy way out or they think they're special. I think it's more the latter. They're not really knowledgeable of the scholars from the other perspective. That's my answer to Frank in this interview. And instead of James seeing that I'm doing that in this interview, he's face planting there. And because I think White has just grown so accustomed to seeing me through a negative, bad light, he can't even entertain the idea that I might actually be giving an appropriate answer that's reasonable by suggesting that, when I came to become a Calvinist, I was coming out of a bed of ignorance of the doctrines, and I didn't know a lot. I was raised in more of a whosoever will kind of, John 3:16 mentality, because it was just the intuitive reading of the text. I was never introduced to a Calvinistic interpretation, but I also wasn't introduced to an Arminian or provisionistic interpretation of Ephesians 1 either. I was ignorant of those doctrines and my views of them, and that was my testimony. And I'll let you hear his reaction to my testimony.
Really, Leighton? You were raised on the Puritans, right?
Nope.
You were. Only thing you had read outside of Pilgrim's Progress was the Institutes of the Christian Religion and maybe a few articles by B.B. Warfield, right? Sorry.
What? Yeah, sorry. What are you talking about, James White? I was saying I was ignorant of the doctrines of predestination and election. Didn't know anything about them. I knew John 3:16, and I just had an intuitive belief that anybody could believe, that Jesus loved everybody, anybody could believe, anybody could be saved. That's all I knew. And out of that ignorance, Calvinistic interpretation of Ephesians 1 and Romans 9 and John 6 and other passages were introduced to me by MacArthur. And I adopt Calvinistic interpretation of those texts. And I came to become a Calvinist. In my experience, many people my age and even younger are coming into Calvinism in much the same way. That's, I think, verifiable. I think that's objectively just the way this young, restless reform movement has happened. May not be your experience, may not be in your circles, but that's my testimony of it. Why you're mocking that and why you're face planting all those kinds of things, or face palming, all that kinds of, that's demonstrating just your lack of charity towards me and your lack of being reasonable in a discussion. And I think stuff like this kind of playground level argumentation approach, the pulling of the pigtail kind of approach, I think it would stop if he was in person with me. Because when we're in person, James is fairly cordial, at least more so. And that's usually the case when you're not just hiding behind a screen or a fraud broadcast, when you're actually seeing the person's reaction in time, you tend to be a little bit nicer to people. Hear them out, don't say offensive things right to their face. It's easier when you're just broadcasting to this nebulous world on the internet that you're able to say things like this. And this is one of the reasons I've invited you onto the program, because having these discussions live and in person would be, I think, helpful for people to see how we should really engage with each other despite our disagreements.
That interpretation, because it was the one introduced to me first, and so that's the reason that I adopted it. I don't think I ever had the motivation of being lazy or trying to avoid evangelism when I was a Calvinist. I don't ever remember that being a motivation. Though it could be the motivation of some, I have no idea. We can't read the minds of Calvinists as to why they choose one particular interpretation over another. It's just been my experience in the time doing this that very few of, especially the young internet type Calvinists, have actually given time to really examine the deep theological robust scholars from the other side.
Yeah, those robust scholars, you'll notice that they can they have a real broad broad view of things. So there's all sorts of views of God you can come up with, and you can play around with open theism, and the problem is Leighton can't come up with a firm foundation.
Okay, so his argument to me there of saying these people aren't really familiar with the best of the best arguments from Arminians and provisionists, which I think is just a verifiable objective fact of the matter. Okay, most of them aren't really aware of the actual teachings of the scholars from the other side. His answer to that is, well, yeah, but when you get to know who those are, there's all kinds of them. There's open theist kinds, there's these kinds that hold to this view. And this. I could say the same thing about the robust Calvinist scholars. There's some of them that are more hyper, the A.W. Pinks that say God doesn't love everybody, where the MacArthurs, they write a book against that kind of view. There's some of you that are CRT and some of you are not CRT, or some of you who promote, tattoos and booze and cigars, and some of you speak out against it. And there's some of you, in other words, what does that have to do with the point? Nothing. What's he doing? He's just casting shade upon the other side, because the other side has various perspectives on other doctrines that are disputable, as if that's not true of his own system. And it is. There are people who affirm Calvinistic soteriology who hold to various views that White himself has critiqued on his program. Does that therefore prove Calvinism is wrong? Of course not. Again, it's just casting shade. It's a form of guilt by association.
To stand on and tell us really about God's sovereign decree, or does he really know the future, or why does he know the future? And he's come up with all sorts of theories that we've just demonstrated are so far out to lunch that it's not even funny. But that's that sound scholarship that none of the rest of us have ever examined.
None of the rest of us have ever examined. Is that what I said? Or did I say the young internet Calvinists, the young restless reform movement that's growing? That's the tendency among them. Did I say none of the rest of you? No, I didn't say that. I specifically said many of the young, restless, reformed, new internet Calvinist types. I'm not trying to say every single Calvinist. Chris Date wouldn't fit that profile, for example. He is a Calvinist who has well studied these doctrines from both perspectives, okay? And he treats me much more cordially than you do, okay? He knows how to treat people who disagree with him a lot better than you do. And so I don't put everybody into that camp. I'm just saying, in my experience, the big surge of the internet young restless reform types tend to not have a good working knowledge. And if you are representative of one of their scholars, one of the best, if MacArthur is a representation of one of the scholars, the best of the best, if Sproul is a representation of one of the scholars, the best of the best, and I can demonstrate where MacArthur and Sproul and White completely misrepresent Arminians, then what have I done? I've shown you that not only are the internet, the uneducated Calvinists out there really uneducated about their opponents, but the best of the best scholars out there are very uneducated about their opponents, because we've shown how MacArthur and Sproul and White have completely misaligned over and over and over again what actual scholars from their other perspective teach and say. And again, we're not just making that blanket accusation. We play him in his own words, and then we show him that's not what Arminians are saying. That's not what provisionists are saying. That's not what that scholar is teaching. And yet he just presented them as if he did. And so if the best of the best are doing it, and we can demonstrate how the best of the best are doing it, how much more so are those who are following them on the internet going to do it?
It's like, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. They have mostly kind of surrounded themselves in an echo chamber of other Calvinists telling them what the other side believes.
Yeah, that never happens amongst the Soteriology 101 folks.
No, it doesn't. Because if you're a Soteriology 101 folk, you have heard my debate with James White. You have heard my discussion with Chris Date, several discussions with Chris Date. You have heard from John Piper directly. You have heard from John MacArthur directly. You have heard from R.C. Sproul directly. You have heard their own words. You have read them on our screen over and over. So you're not in an echo chamber if you're a Soteriology 101 listener, because you are constantly hearing the other side. Now you're hearing me critique them after you hear their words, but you're not in an echo chamber. And what my accusation is that many, not all, but many of the young restless reform types are only getting their news from the biased sources, the leading Calvinistic scholars, who are not very good at representing Arminians and provisionists. And I think that's demonstrable in the sense that it can be shown directly how bad they misalign the scholars from the other perspective.
And that's one of the reasons they treat us like we're doofuses sometimes, is because they just assume that we're as dumb as the scholars and the leaders within their community are telling them about us. And that's one of the reasons I started the program.
And by the way, I'm saying that because just a few weeks before this interview, I had played a clip from some Calvinists that were treating us like we were just ignorant. Like, well, it was Steve Lawson talking about how we just don't know our Bibles. And the reason we're not Calvinists is because we just don't know the Bible. We don't know the Scripture very well. We're ignorant of the Bible. If we knew more about the Bible, then we would be Calvinists. And so what is he doing? He's treating us like we're dumb, like we're a doofus. And that's what I'm confronting when I teach it. And that's Steve Lawson. That's a leading Calvinistic scholar, a well-respected Calvinistic scholar. That's an example that's not just an internet Calvinist commenter. That's an actual leading scholar that's doing that. Do you see Brian Abishano, a leading Arminian scholar, doing that kind of thing to Calvinists? Do you see me doing that often to Calvinists? Am I typically pretty respectful towards my Calvinist friends and those I have on my program? Do you see other leading Arminians? I'm trying to think of the Arminians we've had on our program. We've had several, of course, David Allen, Harwood, and others. I'm thinking of some of the other ones we've interviewed recently. I've got some of their books over here. Do you see them out there completely misaligning and calling out Calvinists in that same way, in a very mean kind of fashion? Typically not. Typically, the Arminians and the provisionists are fairly respectful in their treatment towards the Calvinists. And yet we can demonstrate how many of the leading Calvinists are not reciprocating and not doing that well in representing us.
I'm just to say, hey, there's some really sharp guys like Dr. Turek and many, many others who do not hold to a more deterministic reading of the text.
I don't really have.
Yeah, okay. Well, there, wasn't much there, and in fact, it was more Leighton than it was Frank. But Dr. Turek, you really, if you're going to address this issue, brother, you've got a lot of reading you need to be doing. A lot of reading you need to be doing, because your words just demonstrate a fundamental lack of understanding of the basics of this issue, and so I would highly encourage you to consider those things.
Okay, condescension is the last one I would say. Don't condescend another scholar. Listen to the whole interview, and I think you will see that Frank has well established his perspective. Listen to him walk through Romans and hit through Romans 9 and tell me he hasn't thought through these issues or he hasn't read the other perspectives. And again, goes back to what he said earlier. Have you read the things I've actually published? Because you've just demonstrated in this short clip that we just listened to, you haven't read your opponents, and yet you're expecting your friend Frank to read his. And so, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, so to speak. We all should be willing to read and actually engage with the people on the other side, which is what we do here. One of the reasons I have almost 2-hour-long videos, and that's usually the max. And by the way, we produce a lot of shorts too, so we hit both targets here. The reason I have these long videos is because I so desire to listen and respond to what I'm hearing. Okay, I want to engage with what the Calvinist is actually saying and what they mean by what they say. That's why I talk about the meaning of the words, the different vocabulary that Calvinists often have. And I'll say, okay, they said this. What is meant underneath that? And what's the implications of what that means? Now, the Calvinists might not like that implication, but we may see it as a logical implication of the claims of their system. They may not like that we say that that's an implication of their system, but that's an argument we're making. And we can make the same, that they can do the same thing to us too. They can say, well, an implication of his view leads to this. And they can make an argument for that. And we can say, well, we don't believe it leads to that. And we go back and forth. And that's where the volleying often happens. But you don't have to be condescending about it. You don't have to be disrespectful. You don't have to do the face palming and the feigning of disbelief that somebody could actually disagree with you, even though they hold to a very well-known, well-established position that's been held by many in the church throughout church history. And that's why I'm pointing out the way in which White has wrongly debated and chosen to engage with provisionists for whatever reason, and to encourage you not to take the same path. When the opponent pulls your pigtail, you can scream and throw a rock at them, and you're right there on their level. Or you can demonstrate why pulling pigtails is just not productive. It's playground argumentation. It's not helpful. And you can do so respectfully. Say, yeah, I respect your work in this, and I really love what you wrote on the doctrine of the Trinity, and I love what you do in many of your apologetics debates. I love what you've done in your confrontation of Mormonism and your confrontation of Islam. I respect you, brother, but the way in which you're treating me right now is not helpful to the church. What you just said there is, a fallacious argument, and here's why. So let's talk about this issue instead. Let's actually hit on the doctrinal differences. Let's not grab a clip out of its context and then draw conclusions that we know our opponent doesn't actually believe, because that happens all too often on White's program. We'll grab something out of context, play a 20-second clip of it, and say, therefore Leighton believes this, even though he knows full well, I don't believe that. And he's been told, I don't believe that. And then he doubles down when he's corrected. That White has done things like that over and over and over again. That's not how you debate theology. That hurts the kingdom, and it hurts our ability to engage with each other in a reasonable way. And I'm calling us to a higher discord, a higher level of conversation. Now, I've seen it on some of the side chat stuff, as well as just remembering it from other comments. And if I've missed you here, Jamie Russell, thank you for your super sticker. Appreciate that. Why even respond to White? I've heard that 1,000 times. Don't just ignore him. And there have been times I've just ignored him. There's been a couple of times where it wasn't anything of substance. It was the same thing as you said before. It's like, there's no reason to do another video. But there's a couple of reasons that, and I've prayed about this, genuinely on my knees, actually, God, what do I need to do here? How do I respond here? I don't want to respond in pride. I want to know what my motivations in my heart really is about this situation. And there was two main reasons that kept coming up into my mind. One is James White has a wide audience, and especially on the internet and with young people. My son, Cooper, told me he was introduced to James White before he even knew we debated. Like he saw his stuff. He was had friends in school that were in Mormonism and got into discussion about it and looked up about stuff on Mormonism and happened to come across James White's material. And so he later found out, this was years after he later found out, oh, you debated that guy. I really like that guy. I mean, he's really good. I said, yeah, you should. He's got some good material out there. Okay. So he has a wide audience because he covers a vast array of topics. His livelihood is an apologist. My livelihood is an evangelist, a director of evangelism for Texas Baptist. I happen to do this as a side thing for the sociology thing, but he does this for a living. So he's covering a wide variety of topics, and therefore he's got a wide audience that's listening to him for differing reasons. And so because of that, when he engages with me over this particular topic, he's introducing this issue to not only Calvinists, but to people who are struggling with this issue in other ways, okay? And that has been one of the avenues that God, in my estimation, has blessed this ministry. And that we have over 60,000 followers now is largely due, in my estimation, to James White. I owe James White a huge debt of gratitude for exposing what we're saying about God's provision and love for all people. I owe that to James White. Now, he's not intentionally making that happen, obviously, but his willingness to, even when he misrepresented us, his willingness to at least engage and debate us has led us to be on stages we would not be on otherwise, and to produce and to do things that I would not have been able to do otherwise. And for that, I'm very grateful for James White. I'm not trying to say that jokingly or mockingly. I really am. I mean, I know my heart. When I prayed, I actually thanked God for James White being in my life, because he pushed me. I don't know that I would have written this book if it not been for James White. He pushed me. I think much like he could thank God for Geisler, because Geisler, I think it was Geisler, Norman Geisler, yeah. I think he wrote his book largely in that dispute, through that dispute, because it pushed him to go deeper. In the same way, I'm genuinely thankful for somebody. I'm thankful for Chris Date in much of the same way. Now, Chris Date's on a different level as far as his ability to debate, in my estimation, and his engagement with people. I think Chris Date is far superior in his approach to these things than White has demonstrated himself to be. That's just my opinion, but nevertheless, and that's not good to do. I shouldn't have said that. Forgive me. See, I made a mistake. I'll give you a good illustration of what not to do in debate. You shouldn't pit one opponent against another like that. I did that, and I shouldn't have done that. That's unfair, because I know that Chris Date has a respect for White, and you shouldn't pit other scholars against each other. So don't do that. See, I make mistakes, but I do think Chris Date is a good scholar, and I do admire Chris Date. And there's other Calvinists. Sean Cole, who we've had on the program several times back in the day. We haven't engaged with Sean in some time, but he was always a real respectful Calvinist to me, and always engaged me with respect, and did really. He's probably still to this day. He's not a notable Calvinist by any means, but he wouldn't call himself a notable Calvinist. But he's one of the few, and there are others that have actually tried to understand and represent provisionism fairly in order to critique it. And so that I'm grateful for when I find those kinds of Calvinists to engage with, because I enjoy that. I actually enjoy engaging with people who disagree with me, believe it or not. It's fun to spar in some ways with people, to think deeply about things and to learn from it. I think Tim Stratton would say thanks to God for Bignon, the French theologian that he's engaged with back and forth. They've kind of debated these subjects a lot. And Tim really strikes me as the kind of man who approaches this in the way that I want to approach these things, with a real humble, genuinely humble approach towards his adversary, quote unquote, his opponent in these theological discussions. Because at the ETS last year, the Evangelical Theological Society meeting that they have every year, it's coming up in Colorado in a few months. Well, actually, whenever it is. Yeah, well, this month, actually, coming up soon. And Tim will be there. If Tim's watching, hello, Tim. I'll see you there. Tim Stratton's one of our professors, along with Chris Date, at Trinity Theological Seminary, if you're looking for a higher theological education, by the way. And so I saw Tim Stratton talking to Bignon in the hallway at one of the ETS meetings. And he was making a point, and he was presenting his view, which he knew that Bignon disagreed with, but he was doing it in such a humble way, and kind of deferring to Bignon to say, am I thinking about this wrongly? What would you be your pushback here? What would you say to this? And was just presenting his view. And I thought that, and then Bignon very humbly replied to him, and kind of gave this interchange back and forth in the hallway. And I was watching this and I was going, this is just cool. Two great minds having a very deep philosophical discussion about these things, but they are showing a level of respect for each other, deference to each other, learning from each other, allowing each other to push the other one deeper into the way they think about these things, that I think there's a purpose for having that kind of freedom within the Christian world, that we are able to push each other to go deeper, to love one another even amidst our disagreements. And I think that can be a healthy thing. I don't think we need to run from that. I think that we need to learn how to engage with each other in a healthy way, to love one another. And so let's strive to do that as we leave this place. And as we always say, when you leave here, go now, share Christ, and show love. God bless.